War zones and battlefields are already terrifying, but sometimes soldiers face things that go beyond the horrors of combat. In today's video, we're sharing real stories from armed forces members' encounters, so terrifying, they'll stay with you long after you've heard them. If you enjoy my content, please hit like and subscribe. I'm creating these videos to raise funds for my dad's medical treatment, and your support helps more than you know. If you'd like to contribute, the GoFundMe link is in the description below. Thank you for being here, and now, let's dive into these unforgettable stories. Story 1. I was at basic training at Fort Jackson in 2009, and we were in the woods doing our 7-day FTX field training exercise. One night, we were on guard duty, and there were rumors that the drill sergeants were going to attack us. I was at a checkpoint with 2 other guys. It was a dark, dirt trail in the middle of the woods, with thick brush on both sides, and just a few feet away from the tree line in either direction. I can't remember if our shift was 1 or 2 hours, but it was around 2 a.m. and close to the end of it. Despite the late hour, all 3 of us were alert. We were a bunch of high-speed dorks, and we weren't about to get shown up by the drill sergeants. So, about a quarter mile away, we finally saw a flashlight coming up the trail. It was bouncing up and down, just like someone walking at a medium pace with a flashlight. We all noticed it immediately, got into position, and waited, watching it approach. All 3 of us stared at that light as it got closer and closer for what felt like 5 minutes, occasionally whispering to each other about what we should do. But just as the light got close enough, about 20 or 30 meters away, where we should have been able to see the person behind it suddenly veered off the trail into the brush. It moved in a way that no person holding a flashlight could have done, without any sign of slowing down or choppy steps. Then, as it became clear there was no one behind the light, it floated up, maybe 10 or 15 feet into the air, still heading towards us, but now through the woods instead of on the trail. When it got to about 10 feet away, the light just fizzled out with a little trail, then disappeared. We were all just standing there like, what the hell was that? We spent the next 10 minutes of our shift in silence before heading back to the tents. No drill sergeants came through that night. Story 2. I was in Afghanistan, doing overnight radio guard in the CP command post. Around 0230, me and the other guy on duty were just sitting there, bullshitting and fighting off the sleep monster. Out of nowhere, we both heard what sounded like an abnormally large, deep-voiced goat bleating in pain. It sounded far away, so we kind of just ignored it and kept talking. But not even 10 seconds later, we heard it again, this time twice as loud. Now, it sounded like it was coming from above and behind us. We both looked at each other, frozen for a few seconds, and I could feel every hair on my body standing on end. Without a word, we jumped up, grabbed our rifles, and ran outside to check it out. But really, we were running away from the sound like scared little kids. Outside, we didn't see or hear anything, and now we were both confused. Then it hit me. What about the civilian advisor who lives on the compound with us? He's tough as nails, but he's also old. Did we just leave him behind? Possibly having a heart attack or something. We rushed back inside, and sure enough, there he was, up and walking around, looking just as confused as us. Sir, are you okay? Yeah, I'm fine. Were you two making that bloody noise? We thought it was you. Well, I thought it was you guys. At least we knew we weren't imagining things. But now what? The civilian, who was a British expat, that later became an American citizen, after fighting in Northern Ireland, suggested we check all the rooms. So, that's exactly what we did. The 2 of us, the only POGs non-infantry in the entire infantry company, awkwardly went about clearing rooms like we knew what we were doing. Now, mind you, this civilian could have at least given us a few pointers on how not to look dumb while clearing rooms. But instead, he just stood back and watched us bumble our way through it. After checking all the rooms, we didn't find anything. We decided to wake up our XO executive officer and tell him about the strange noises. He basically told us to stop being sissies and go back on watch. The rest of the night was uneventful, and no one else ever experienced anything like that again. I'm an extremely skeptical person, so I don't think it was a ghost or anything paranormal. But honestly, I don't have a good explanation either. Maybe it was the unit across the street messing with us, or some weird animal. I don't know. All I do know is that I definitely heard something. Story 3. I was a young soldier at my first duty station. We had been moved from Turner Barracks in West Berlin to Andrews Barracks across town, while they remodeled Turner. It was summer in Berlin on a Sunday night. I was sitting in the barred window of a basement laundry room just up the street from the barracks. Pretty much all the ground level windows were barred at Andrews, so at the time, I thought nothing of it. The laundry was near the end of a low corridor with overhead plumbing, and you had to hit a timer switch to light it up. Besides the washers and dryers, there were only 2 notable items in the room: a Kiss pinball machine and an old jukebox. As I sat in the window reading a book, I had the place to myself. It was late, and Sunday night was my go-to for laundry for this very reason. Suddenly, I heard a noisy metallic click and whirl. It was coming from the jukebox. Since I was the only one there, my first thought was that someone was pranking me. I hopped off the windowsill and darted to the hall, slapping the light timer. The hall was empty. I glanced down at my Timex as the needle dropped on a record. It was midnight on the dot. Music began to blare from the jukebox. A cold sweat suddenly erupted, and I felt it trickle down my back. Living easy? I sprang into action, wrenching the dryer open and slamming my damp beady ass into my laundry bag. Loving free, I wanted so badly to be anywhere else. Season ticket on a one-way ride. I knew damn well where this song was leading, and I had no intention of being in that laundry room when the chorus hit. I beat a hasty retreat back to the barracks, where I had a fitful night of sleep. The next day, I didn't say anything to anyone until after final formation. That's when I saw an older SSG on CQ duty. He was sipping coffee that was probably spiked with Baileys. On his second 3-year hitch in Berlin, and wasn't in my platoon. In short, he was the perfect person to ask about ghostly events. So, I opened with, "You ever hear of anything strange happening here at Andrews SSGB?" He immediately broke into a grin. "Well, for starters, talk to anyone over in HQ barracks, and they'll tell you about the late-night phantoms marching in the halls," he said. He went on to tell me about people who would whip open their doors late at night, telling whoever was doing drill and ceremony in the hall to cut it out only, to find an empty hallway with just one central stairwell. Feeling encouraged that maybe my story wasn't so ridiculous, I asked, "Anything in particular about the basement laundry?" As a matter of fact, yes, specialist," he replied, leaning back in his chair with a grin that told me I wasn't going to be reassured by what came next. The laundry was a cell where Hitler tortured his political rivals to death on the night of the long knives. I blinked a couple of times, thanked him for the history lesson, and decided that late-night laundry was no longer an option for me. Story 4. The night sky out in the sands of a non-disclosed desert in the Middle East can get you lost in a gaze. There was one time I saw a strange light white and making abnormal movements. Naturally, I thought it was a UA's unmanned aerial system, but as I continued to watch, it just did things a UA's wouldn't do. At some point, the one light split into 2, and they began moving parallel to each other. Then, suddenly, they started moving individually. Eventually, they flew out of the blast zone, where the radiation device I was operating was located, and passed straight overhead, disappearing into the distance. They looked like they were at satellite-level altitude. No counter-UAS systems picked anything up. But I got a strange unknown on my system that night, at a disturbingly high altitude. It cleared a long distance to reach where I was, if it was what I had picked up on the system. I'm talking thousands of kilometers in a matter of minutes. It was all just chalked up to a site anomaly in official reports. But, I don't know, man. Something wasn't right about that. Story 5. I've got two. Once, I was looking through the BIOC at a gunnery range and saw what looked like a person downrange, walking behind a berm, upright, hot, and everything. Confused as hell, I focused on it as it disappeared behind the terrain. What emerged on the other side of the berm had suddenly changed into a deer. The second one is an OSOT story. I was on fire guard, had just finished my chores, and was folding and putting away laundry in the middle of the night. Standard stuff, nothing out of the ordinary. Out of nowhere, there was a loud creak, like someone opening their wall locker, but way louder, coming from above and directly behind me. It woke up the person in the rack next to mine, who asked if it had been me. It was not. I finished my laundry and walked back over to my fireguard buddy, asking him if he'd heard that loud creak. He said he had, and that to him it sounded like it was also above and behind him, in extremely close proximity. That couldn't be true, since my locker and rack were in the opposite corner of the bay from the fireguard desk. I was a little on edge for the rest of the shift. Story 6. A few years ago, as a new private at my unit, I was on staff duty while my NCO was off doing checks. A guy came in and said his name was Specialist Johnson from Bravo Battery, and he was signing in from leave. I annotated this on the 1594. When my NCO came back from his checks, he asked if anything had happened. I told him Specialist Johnson from Bravo Battery signed in from leave. My NCO gave me a very confused look and asked what he looked like. I said he was white, had a mustache, wore a red and black flannel shirt, blue jeans, and a hat. My NCO then told me that a Specialist Johnson had died in the early 2000s on his way back from leave in a car accident. He said that sometimes shifts would report a Specialist Johnson signing in from leave, but there would be no leave form or record of him being there. And, apparently, my description matched the others. I also swear the Fort Sill reception barracks are haunted. I never experienced anything there myself, but they always gave me an off feeling, and others said they heard screams or footsteps. When they would check it out, nothing would be there. I've also heard stories of figures being seen late at night in the 18th Airborne Corps headquarters at Fort Bragg. Looking at it, you can tell it's an old building. It used to be a hospital way back in the day. I've heard from people who have been on staff duty there that they've seen nurses or figures in BTUs. Finally, my drill sergeant told us stories about how he saw UFOs at Fort Irwin. He said he never wants to go back there because of how strange the experience was. He and his buddy were in a Humvee when a huge bright light flew about 20 feet in front of them. They immediately stopped, and so did the light. It stayed there for a few minutes before flying off. He asked his buddy if he saw it too, and he said yes. They both didn't know what to do, so they just pretended it didn't happen and drove off. Story 7. This story started during basic training at Fort Benning, when I was doing Infantry 8 Advanced Individual Training, back in 2002. One night, while pulling fire guard in the middle of the night, something strange happened. I was at one end of the bay near the door, looking down at the rows of bunks. I saw someone walk out from between the bunks and head into the latrine. Nothing out of the ordinary, so I continued to sit and stare around the bay. After a few minutes, I hadn't heard a flush or seen the soldier return. So I got up and walked to the latrine, half expecting to find someone passed out on a toilet or something. But when I checked, there was no one there. I walked around the bay, and nothing seemed out of place, so I chalked it up to a sleep deprivation hallucination. Fast forward 5 years, and I'm out of the army and going to school. I met another infantry veteran while playing rugby, and we became great friends. It turns out he had been in the same platoon in basic training just 8 years earlier. One day, we were talking about our time in basic, and he starts telling me a story that sounds all too familiar. Someone in his platoon saw a soldier go into the bathroom in the middle of the night and never come back out. A chill ran down my spine as he continued. He and his battle buddies were determined to figure out who was messing with them, so they set up an ambush. When they saw the guy heading for the bathroom, 4 guys charged in from all directions, only to find no one. The next day, the drill sergeants overheard them talking about it and said, "Oh, I see you all have met our ghost." They then explained that a trainee had committed suicide in the barracks several years back, and now there are reports of a ghost from trainees. At that moment, my own experience came rushing back to me. I couldn't believe it. It was something I had just written off, but now I had an explanation. So if you were in 2nd Platoon, Alpha 258 Partis, and saw something weird, now you know what it was. Story 8. I was a scout in the 1st Battalion, 30th Infantry, stationed at Ledwood Barracks in Schweinfurt, Germany. I arrived in the summer of 1984 and left after 27 months in the fall of 1986. We lived in barracks that Hitler had built. They were big, damp, and perfect for idiots like us. The walls were a meter thick with window shelves on both the inside and outside. They were bulletproof and mostly idiot-proof. We had 5 floors, including the basement. The ground floor was about 20% administrative offices and 80% company and battalion staff. The 2nd floor housed the cooks and maintenance personnel, because a mechanized infantry battalion has a lot of wrench turners. The 3rd floor was for scouts, mortars and medics. The top floor was for our tow gunner company, which was on its way out. I explain all this to set the scene. There were people all over the barracks all the time, except for the basement. The basement consisted of a hallway running from end to end, with the arms room, NBC, nuclear, biological, chemical room, and various supply rooms branching off it. Back then, we had charge of quarters CQ duty, which usually consisted of a sergeant and 5 runners, 1 for each floor. Duty schedules came up on a DA6, the duty roster, and you always hoped to get Thursday duty. I was a barracks rat and would pull CQ for people in exchange for money. I took a Saturday duty for a buddy of mine for $40. The only problem was that I had partied hard the night before and was running on about 3 hours of sleep. The day part of my duty went fine, but the basement only had a single chair by one of the stairwells for the runner to sit in. The problem with the chair was that it was amazingly comfortable, and if you were caught sleeping, it meant an Article 15 with a guaranteed loss of a stripe. So, there I was, walking from one end of the basement to the other in this damp, cold space, plodding along, wondering about the poor life choices that had led me to that point. I reached the end of the hallway, turned around, and saw a man about 20 meters in front of me. He was just standing there, his hands hanging by his sides. He was wearing a long, grey woolen coat with a high collar. At first, I thought it was one of our 4.2 mortar guys who always dressed weird, but then I looked into his eyes, and he was gone. No puff of smoke, no flash, nothing. 1 second he was there, and the next, he wasn't. I walked down to where I had seen him, near the stairwell. But there was nothing, no weird smells, no signs, just an empty basement. I went upstairs to chat with the guys on the 1st floor, half hoping to ask if they had seen anything. They hadn't noticed anything unusual, so I went back to my basement, slogging. Here we are, almost 40 years later, and I still have no explanation. Story 9. We were deployed to Darmstadt, Germany, post 9/11s, to provide force protection to regular army units. We were housed in German officer barracks at Frankenstein Kaserne, and life was good. Each of us, from E1 through O-3, had our own room and were split between 2 3-story barracks buildings. Every day, we'd bus to and from Cambrai-Fritsch to carry out our mission. During our downtime, we would drink and play pool, watch TV, or hit the German clubs and bars. Life was quiet, mundane but good. Fast forward to midsummer 2002. After returning from Babenhausen, we quickly got reacquainted with our old housing. Same rooms, same routines, a different month. At some point, after returning from working a checkpoint, I found the faucet in my room turned on. Background: each of our rooms was a single man space, furnished with a bed, a massive wall locker, a desk, and sometimes a few extra pieces of furniture. Some of us even had a fridge, if we were lucky, or had enough rank. The base itself was still under German control, not the US government. The local German commander allowed us to stay there due to the post-9/11's mission to protect our assets from potential threats. The buildings were bomb-proof, typical for German architecture. Constructed from solid masonry blocks, these buildings were fortresses. Each block was massive, about 1 meter long, 1/2 meter wide, and 1/2 meter high, requiring cranes to move them into place. They had been built to last, likely a reaction to Germany's past, having been devastated by 2 world wars. Fast forward again. I find the water turned on in my room, not once, not twice, but repeatedly. After the first few times, I asked around, trying to figure out who might be messing with me. But deep down, I had a feeling this wasn't the work of someone in my dimension. Here's why. The walls were solid masonry, and the locks were designed in true German fashion. Instead of a simple lock with 1 cut on the key, these locks required keys with 3 separate cuts, like a T-shape. Picking one of these locks would require manipulating 3 different tumblers at once. After the first time I found my water on, I made sure to double-check both my faucet and the door lock every time I left the room. Then, there were the windows, also typically German in design, with a tilt sash mechanism. From the outside, they were impossible to open without breaking the glass. From the inside, they had a lever with 3 settings: down to lock, sideways to open inward like a casement window, and up to tilt the window slightly for ventilation. You couldn't jimmy these windows, they were built like everything else in the building, solid. After about 2 weeks of finding the water on every 2 or 3 days, nearly everyone in my squad, and probably my platoon, had heard about it. It got to the point where people followed me from the bus to my room after duty, just to see if I was full of it. Sure enough, every time I opened the door, the water was running. About 3 weeks into this weird experience, I was lying in bed one night, trying to nod off. The barracks were rock solid and dead quiet, thanks to those 1/2 meter thick masonry walls. I had a shelf I used as a headboard, which held some of my medical gear. I was a medic attached to an infantry unit. As I was lying there, I heard a noise behind my head, like someone sliding an item across the shelf. I froze, my mind racing. A few seconds later, I heard it again, and goosebumps covered my entire body. I felt a chill and immediately jumped up, panicked but trying to stay quiet. I turned on the light, but everything looked normal. Nothing was out of place. Suddenly, I remembered a story my mother had told me. She was somewhat psychic and once told me about a woman who bought a haunted house. This woman experienced windows opening in the dead of winter and doors slamming all night. At her wit's end, the woman sat on the stairs one night and spoke to the ghost, explaining that she meant no harm and wanted to live peacefully. From that point on, the ghost stopped disturbing her. Feeling a bit silly, I took a page from that woman's playbook. I sat on my bed and started talking to the ghost. I explained that I was an American soldier deployed to Germany after a terrorist attack on US soil. I told the ghost that I didn't mean any harm and that we'd be rotating out in a few months. I also asked the ghost if they were re-out to give me a sign, but not to scare me at that moment. No kidding. The next day, I returned to my barracks after duty, and my room was spotless. Now, my room was usually a mess random, beer bottles, laundry scattered around, nothing tidy. But when I walked in, everything was neatly arranged. The 6 Budweiser bottles were stacked in their 6-pack holder. The items on my desk were neatly squared away, like someone with OCD had organized them. My bed was made perfectly, military style. There was also a lock hanging on my wall locker. I hadn't seen the key for months, and frankly, I didn't care about it. That key was sitting on my pillow. Even writing this 18 years later, I get chills remembering it. I went next door to grab Sergeant Pencil Mustache. See previous posts for background on him. At this point, he couldn't tell if I was telling the truth, or if I was just a drama-hungry lunatic. I spent that night in the day room, and although that was the last time I heard from the ghost, it wasn't the only strange instance in those buildings. As my story spread through the company, other stories began to surface. One soldier, who we'll call Private Shitbag, once found himself locked out of his room on the 3rd floor of the building across from mine. After hours of trying to open the door, the German maintenance crew came with an extension ladder to check the window. They found that his wall locker had somehow been moved in front of the door, blocking it entirely. Other guys shared stories of hearing women and children running up and down the hallways late at night. When they opened the doors to check, the hallways were empty. This was a closed post, and the only women allowed on base had to check in and couldn't stay past a certain time. It still gives me chills thinking about it. Story 10. Being stationed at Yokota AFB in the 90s gave me the opportunity to work on some very old and crusty C-130E and H aircraft. These planes were straight out of the Vietnam era, and maybe even earlier. The airframe hours on these planes were so high that if they were civilian aircraft, the FAA would have had a heart attack. But these weren't civilian, they were ghosts on the tarmac at Yokota. We kept those birds flying, and I would have flown anywhere on them except for 1490. It was well known that the C-130s stationed at Yokota had been used during the Vietnam War to transport soldiers who perished on the battlefield. Because of this, I always believed these planes were haunted. Most of the aircraft didn't give off any particular vibes, but 1490, that one was different. It reeked of spectral anomalies, and every time we had to work on it, my skin crawled. As a low-ranking airman, I was often stuck with the mid-shift. 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. That meant we worked on the aircraft in the dead of night, when everything was pitch black. Our supervisor would drive us out to the hard stands, where the planes were parked, to perform whatever maintenance was required. In the 90s, the hard stands on the Fusashi side were separated by grass, and across the runway, on the Takikawashi side, there were other hard stands that were almost never used. They were practically abandoned. Problem aircraft like 1490 ended up sitting out there. Most nights, you don't really pay attention to the tail numbers. You just get the job done, so you can get back to the truck, park it at the end of the runway, and nap until morning. But on this particular night, we were sent to the farthest hard stand across the runway. The area was covered in a thick layer of fog. The truck dropped off 2 of us at the aircraft, then returned to the hangar to grab a part. Great, we thought. We could head to the cockpit, sit in the pilot and co-pilot seats, and take a little nap. We were just starting to drift off when we heard a noise from the back of the aircraft. At first, it sounded like scraping, but then it escalated into the unmistakable sound of chains rattling. The air outside was still and foggy. There were no winds strong enough to cause the aircraft to move or make any noise. The hairs on the back of our necks stood up. That's when it hit us. We were on 1490. We grabbed our toolboxes and quickly exited the aircraft, walking briskly maybe, even running back to the hangar. When we told our story to the other airmen, they weren't surprised. They all knew about the haunting of C-130 E-1490. Thanks so much for sticking around to the end. If these stories left you speechless, Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video with others who love a good scare. Your support means everything, as I'm raising funds to help with my dad's medical treatment. If you're able to donate, the GoFundMe link is in the description below, and any amount is deeply appreciated. And if you or someone you know has had their own intense or terrifying encounter, feel free to share it in the comment side. Love to hear your story. Thanks again for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video.